second session of the Writing Academic Paper Seminar Series. I am X Cabanda. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. And I would like to welcome everyone again for joining us. We are live on Facebook as well as YouTube, and of course here at Zoom. This session is entitled of the Writing Academic Paper Seminar Series. Let me first introduce I am X Cabanda. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the aim of this seminar series is to bridge the National University of Singapore and I would like to welcome everyone again for joining us. We are live on Facebook as well as YouTube, and of course here at Zoom. Local scholarship. This session is entitled of the Writing Academic Paper Seminar Series. First introduce different research and publishing traditions, fellow and the aim of the seminar series is to bridge the National University. Again, thank you for joining us, and I would like to welcome everyone very much and find ways we are live on Facebook as well as YouTube, and of course here at Zoom. How session is entitled of the Writing and this seminar series. I am X Cabanda. I know this fellow the aim of the seminar series is to bridge the National. Again, thank you for joining us, and I would welcome everyone very much and find ways we are live on geography as well as YouTube, and of course here at Zoom. How session is personal note of the Writing and this seminar series. I am X Cabanda. I know this fellow the aim of the seminar series is to bridge the National. Again, thank you for joining us, and I consider her as my mentor, as my friend also. And we are so privileged because in the name of geography and also in migration studies, Professor Parvati is one of those names that we respect and we really read. So we are so privileged this afternoon to have her not to talk about migration or in geography, but to talk about and to help us on how to do theory in academic papers. So without further ado, I'll call on Professor Parvati, but let me remind everyone, please do key in your questions in our YouTube comment section and also in our Facebook comment section and here in the chat box inside Zoom. And we will be able to address your questions later on. For those who are attending here inside Zoom, I will be calling some of you who you will be directed to the question to Professor Parvati, and it will be a very good interaction for us. So again, I'll call now our most distinguished guest this afternoon, Professor Parvati Raghuram from the Open University in the UK, to speak and to teach us and to share to us how to do theory in academic papers. Parvati, the screen is now yours.
Okay, thanks ever so much. And thank you, X, for such a warm and really affectionate introduction. And thanks also very much to Elson and his team for hosting this event. It's an outcome in part of another series of sessions that we did called Writing International Student Migration in Africa, which was all about writing papers. And we did 6 sessions, I think, and those are available on YouTube, and it's under the name of WISMA, W-I-S-M-A. And this is these sessions are in part kind of have arisen targeting slightly different audience, but also doing slightly different things. And it's such a pleasure and privilege to be here and to be part of this because, of course, I have huge and deep commitment to Asian research because of, coming from the continent myself. For me, it's a privilege. It really is a privilege to be able to be here and to speak to you. And thank you very much for this topic as well, because it's a topic on which I feel quite strongly. The reason for it being that very early on, when I did my PhD, I know that I remember to take a picture of a squatter settlement where I was doing my fieldwork, and I wanted to put that up. So I asked my brother, "Can you take a photograph for me?" Of course, this was in the old days. This was about 35 years ago. So you had a camera and you took the image. And my brother said, "I'm not going to take a picture of the squatter settlement and the poverty here to showcase on the white walls of your British university. And I say this because it immediately made me think of what am I doing my research for, who is it for, and what change can I bring? So I say that as an introduction, and I'll come back to that in a minute or two, but I wanted to just for you to hold that thought. What is it that we're doing when we're writing academic papers, when we're doing our PhD? Who are we speaking to? What's the purpose? So if I move on to the next slide, then what you'll see is what I realized is that it made me particularly feel committed to theory. So if we could look at this slide on what is theory. For me, has that moved on? Yeah. No, slide 2. The second slide. What is theory? So what is theory for me then? Theory, in some ways, can be seen as a body of literature. So typically you think, okay, if I have to do theory, I need to read something, yeah? Sometimes you think of theory as a toolkit, as something which will help us to explain something. It already exists, right? So it's there already, and then you just download it, and then you apply it to your empirical case, yeah? Or you could think of theory as opposed to practice, which is that theory is, you know, quite cerebral and practical. And you'll often hear people say this, I'm very practical, I'm not theoretical, right? Sometimes you can say, actually, I have a theory about why this is happening, which means that you've got a presupposition about something. But these are all different versions of how we use the language of theory, right? We think of it as something that you become, you know, it's a hunch. It might be something which is different from practice. It's a body of literature. Yeah, so it's the kind of literature review section, or it's something which already exists, which you can download and then you can apply. But what I'd like to argue, and really in the line with people like, you know, with all those who are working from a Marxist tradition, is the notion of theory as abstraction. Theory as abstraction really means that you are editing in and editing out from a concrete reality, because the world is very complicated, right? It's full of things, right? So you look at a particular thing. So for instance, you look at an urban settlement and you look at what's happening there. Many, many things are happening, right? There's water, there's electricity, there's people working, there is, you know, roads coming in, there's all sorts, there's people, all sorts going on, families living. You're always choosing one aspect to look at, and you're always trying to just understand that aspect, right? So in some ways, you're always in the process of editing in, and editing out. Theorization, in some ways, the first part of theorization is choosing what it is that you're going to edit in and edit out, and the purpose for which one is doing it. So why theorize then? If we move on to the next slide, you'll see that, and returning to my initial case, if you could move, is that what's important is that what does that particular settlement tell you, right? What's important here is not any settlement, but what that particular settlement tells you. What did my little squatter settlement tell you? You'll see that about something. And what did it tell me about, for whom, right? Which is the audience. And the audience is totally crucial, because when you're writing an academic paper, you're writing it for an audience, right? That audience is a particular audience for a particular piece of work. In your case, you're thinking about an audience for a journal, a particular journal, right? That journal will have an audience. So if you're publishing, say, for instance, in the Filipino Journal of Social Sciences, yeah? And I, sitting here, write a paper about Burnley, a small town in England, and send it to your journal, right? what difference would it make to the people who are usually reading this, the Filipino Journal of Social Sciences, right? Why would they need to know about Burnley? What will Burnley tell them about the issues that they're interested in? That always involves abstraction, editing in and editing out. It involves getting away from the particularities of Burnley. It involves thinking, okay, so there's something here which is generalizable, something which they can understand, which they can do something with, right? If you can put your head into that perspective when you write an academic paper, you will understand that actually the key here then is to think about what it is that you're trying to do by theorizing. So if you move on to the next slide, you'll see that that as a result of this, what you get is that theorizing is an ongoing activity throughout a paper. It doesn't sit in just one place in the paper, it sits in different places, yeah? Typically what it does is it appears in like a literature review, or in the conceptual gap, it turns up in the abstract, right? If you read this paper on Burnley, me sitting in the Philippines will still be able to use this because there is a concept, say for instance, about urbanization or about how infrastructures are built, that people in Burnley can tell me, which I, sitting in Mindanao, can also use, right? So that's the gap. That's the conceptual gap. To say that actually there is a gap because there is no literature on Burnley. Well, me sitting in Mindanao, why do I care whether there is literature on Burnley or not, right? And that's typically one of the things that we tend to do. Actually, we should write about this because there's no literature on Nigeria. But why is Nigeria relevant to the people who are reading this journal? You have to make that case. And that case is usually a conceptual gap, right? Then you also return to that in the empirical material. And you say, actually, this is the empirical material and this is the conceptual value. Looking at the case of Burnley will tell me, sitting in Mindanao, that this is the use of this, yeah? So throughout the empirical material, you hold the hand of the reader and you say, actually, yes, I know my case is on Burnley, but still this is relevant to you. So you keep pointing out why it's relevant. That again involves thinking about the abstractions. And then in the conclusion, you return to the conceptual gap and say that my case in Burnley will definitely help you and it will help you to address a range of things. In short, you will have to ask yourself, how will people conceptualize differently after reading your paper? This goes back to the audience. Remember that your audience is academics, right? They deal in ideas. That's their currency, ideas. So they're interested in thinking. They're not practitioners, they're not policymakers, right? So they're not sort of people in those cities or in those squatter settlements, nor are they people who are going to actually say, yes, I'll read your paper and based upon that, I will have this particular policy for this squatter settlement. No, because if you wanted to write that, then you would write that as a blog or as a policy report. You can have a small section on it, but most of these audience of these academic papers is other academics, and they deal with ideas. So you need to return to why that idea that you have offered in the beginning, throughout your paper, what does that mean for further work that people might do on that topic? So moving on to the next slide, there are a few things about doing theory well. The first is the issue of thick abstraction. What do we mean by thick abstraction? So thick abstraction involves really getting to the complexity of the concrete, right? So if you know what concrete means, concrete is the stuff with which, we make houses, right? It's got stones, it's got sand, it's got a bit of lime, it's got a whole range of things, but they still stick together, right? So that's the concrete is exactly the same. There's a concrete reality, which is a mix of a whole set of things which stick together. They're still one thing, right? But there are multiple relationalities in it, multiple dynamics involved in it, but all of them still stick together as the concrete. But so you have to really, for thick abstraction, you have to really get to the detail of the concrete. A thin abstraction, typical, which is the opposite of thick abstraction, would actually use categories which are not necessarily appropriate or adequate to the job of the concrete. For instance, if I say I'm trying to understand the squatter settlement and I'm trying to understand the work going on there, but have I actually really dealt with the concrete, the multiple realities, and have I chosen the correct reality to edit in and edit out? That's what thick abstraction involves, yeah? And this, of course, requires adequate engagement with the empirical material. And I say this as somebody who finds this one of the trickiest things that we see in research. Recently, I had to examine a PhD thesis, and somebody said had written in that there are very few women in STEM in Kazakhstan. Okay, so I'm somewhat familiar with post-socialist societies and their relationship with science and technology, and I thought, is this really true? So I thought, okay, now let me go back and look at the literature on. Very quickly, I did a search and I found a piece which said actually there's only 46% of the people in science and technology in Kazakhstan are women. So, and they have written it, oh, it's terrible, there's not enough women. And this is a person writing from Kazakhstan. Now, this student is writing her thesis in the UK. And I thought, okay, let me look at the figures for the UK. That's what, 15–16% of women in STEM in that particular field of STEM are women. So women only constitute 14 or 15% in that particular part of STEM, right? But she's writing to the English audience because it's her PhDs in the UK, saying there are very few women in STEM in Kazakhstan. And she has a Kazakhstani reference as well, right? And I was thinking, yes, it may be fewer compared to men in Kazakhstan, much, much, much more, and much better than the situation in the UK, right? So engaging with the audience and engaging with the empirical material means actually recognizing that there is a complexity to the place that you're talking about, right? Which is not necessarily transferable, right? So, and this is one of my big bugbears currently, is that people write about a place, they draw down a theoretical thing about a conceptual thing that actually there is a lack, and that this lack needs to be addressed and this lack is because of gendered nature of science. But actually, the empirical material doesn't necessarily support you on that, because you've used theory as a toolkit. You've used a concept like as a toolkit, which is just transferable across places. I also had this with a student, with a PhD, another PhD I examined, where somebody said, actually, single women in India have a very tough life, yeah? And I said, really? Single women in India don't have a tough life compared to many other women, because single women in India, and she was talking about the middle class women, they actually continue to live at home. They often have their parents looking after them. They never have to spend any of their money apart from things that they like, because that's how families operate in India. And I said, is this really true? So, but again, she had used this kind of gendered concept that actually women in India are treated badly. And it's a conceptual argument that she has just taken from the literature, applied it to her material, not really engaged with the empirical material. And this is quite a common issue, but which, doing theory well means adequate engagement with the empirical material. The third is limiting the claims. Really important, are your categories transferable? even something as simple as youth or childhood or concepts like population, do they mean the same thing in every place? Yeah. And not making claims beyond what your empirical material says. So for instance, if you know that this is the case, and this is the example allows you to abstract certain things, you have edited in and edited out some things, you should limit those claims to what is the concept which you have analyzed, the concepts which you have edited in. Don't make claims beyond those concepts. And these are small slippages, yeah? And I make them too, right? So it's not like this comes straight away. Sometimes you have to go back and read your paper and think, oh, from my material, actually, I can't make that claim, but I can make these claims. So I need to remove these claims. And then doing theory well means making clear the relevance of the concepts that you have used, right? Why is it relevant for the audience that is looking at this particular question? So returning to that in the conclusion and saying these concepts, these conceptual developments that I propose in this paper are relevant for a wider group because of such and such reasons. So that's returning to that question of relevance, but of the conceptual relevance, not the empirical relevance alone. So moving on to the next slide, how do we do this theorization? So the first is to be aware of your own presuppositions. So in the case of this woman who's writing on and who's got this sentence on Kazakhstan, she has a presupposition that actually in the West, there must be a lot of women in science and technology because it's modern countries. And therefore, she just writes it. She doesn't even check to see actually what's the figure in the UK, which is her audience compared to Kazakhstan. It is so easy to kind of, if you like, orientalize and to assume that this, global South or so post-socialist countries are kind of have a lack. But being, check the data. Think, I'm submitting this paper to a Western journal. Is this true in the Western journal, right? And maybe this presupposition of mine is completely inappropriate. So now I would say Kazakhstan actually has, because of its post-socialist, in socialism, gender equality in science was a very big part of their kind of ethos. Therefore, I must check, are these figures like this? Are these figures like that? Now, you can see that I've gone from figures to actually an explanatory thing, which is that gender equality in science, in socialism was very important, right? So you've moved from empirical detail to a conceptual framework, an explanatory framework. Then, of course, when you do the literature review, don't just read for where have these cases happened? What are the contexts in which this research has been done? But actually read for the theory in the literature when you're doing the literature review. Read for what are the conceptual, gains. So, for instance, can you divide up the literature into 3 different sort of conceptual issues that they all deal with? And then yours is something which addresses that gap between these 3. Be self-conscious about what you edit in and edit out and why. So for instance, when you think about urban settlement and poverty, for instance, as I was, or gender equality as I was, am I choosing the right things to focus in? And why have I chosen certain kinds of things? Really important to also limit the scope of your claims. So, think you can generalize concepts, but don't generalize empirics, right? And even the concepts, you need to think very carefully about, is this really translatable? And then really important is to move between the abstract and the real. So going back to the case study of this, of the single women, if the person had not just taken down kind of gender inequality, women in India always have a hard time. Therefore, I can use that as my conceptual thing and then apply it to single women. But no, if you look at the single women, their deal is not so bad in the middle classes. So let the empirics speak back to your concepts, right? That's really one of the biggest issues I have currently is that people are not letting the empirics speak back to the concepts. So moving on then to the next slide, writing theoretically. And these are just a few quick tips. Check that it flows from the conceptual gaps that you have set out. Choose the right empirical material for the right theory. Make clear why this empirical material helps you to address that theoretical gap. Then make sure that the empirical material is evidence for your theoretical argument. Yeah, and then return to the conceptual gap. So this is this kind of what I'm reiterating here is this close and iterative relationship between the empirical material and the theoretical argument, right? And just then to end, have I just think again now, have I only set out an empirical gap? For instance, typically, not typically, some papers I see, they will say, well, actually the gap is that actually there's no literature on Cameroon. That's an empirical gap, but you haven't told me why I should read a paper about Cameroon, right? Just because there's no literature on Cameroon, well, there's no literature on many other places either. But, what is it which is generalizable, abstractable? What are you editing out of the particularities of Cameroon that actually me sitting in another country can still see as useful to me? Does the empirical material help me to address that gap? Yeah. So, and this is another problem that we sometimes see in papers is that the empirical material deals with one thing, but then the literature review is about something else. A theoretical argument actually pushes you in another way. How does it allow you to do that? Yeah. How is the empirical material helping me to address that conceptual gap? Have I used the empirical material to explain the conceptual advancement? So throughout the analysis section of the paper, you're going to say, this is what the empirical material says, and therefore the conceptual argument advances in these ways. So typically you have a phase when you write a paper, when you lay out the empirical material, but then you often have to restructure it by saying, okay, these are the three ways in which, these are the three conceptual arguments that I could make from this. Let me give you an example of this. Marcus and I, along with a colleague, Ashley Gunter, have a paper that we've been trying to write on paying fees and for international distance education students and the extent to which money flows are made possible. Now, our case studies are Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and Namibia. Yeah. Now, we could have 3 sections on each of these, but that's not very useful because, again, why would anybody be interested in Namibia or, Nigeria or Zimbabwe? What they would be interested in is that actually in some places money flows. In some places, there's lots of complete blockages, and some places there's friction in money flows, right? Now, if I say those 3 things, you can see that those 3 things actually apply to every case, right? Whether it's, whether you're a student trying to send money from the Philippines to study in Hong Kong or any other mobility, those 3 concepts are transferable. So, and they cut across. So you might have an example from Namibia and Zimbabwe and Nigeria, or any 2 of these, or maybe even just one of these in the question of flows or in friction. So now you have rearranged your paper around these 3 conceptual things rather than thinking it through the empirical cases. And then in the end, we return to why does looking at this through flows, frictions, and non-circulation actually add to the literature. For instance, why does it matter? Well, it matters because ultimately fees are the basis on which a lot of students are being invited. And there's a lot of leakages because of this. So it matters empirically, politically, ethically, because the poorest people are the most hard hit by the non-circulation of fees, right? By the difficulties in actually transferring fees. They have to pay middlemen. They have to do all kinds of things. So empirically, it is important. But conceptually, it is important because we think of limiting the flow of students, visas, categories, all those things. But we assume that finance flows freely, right? But actually linking the flows of finances with the flow of students actually shows that there is a more complex relationship between flows that is going on. And that leads to a whole new, conceptual concern, is that how do we conceptualize the linkages between student flows and money flows? How do we conceptualize the different market relations that each of these is caught up in? And if you can, so that is a transferable thing. Everybody can understand that that's an important thing, right? Whereas if I stick with the case of Namibia and Zimbabwe and Nigeria, that's not transferable, right? You sitting somewhere else won't be able to follow why this is important. Why do I need to know this? So my final point is always think of the audience. And for me, I feel, because I'm quite committed to kind of social change, I just think if I'm going to spend my time taking a picture of this quarter settlement, I have to be able to explain to my brother, why did I take that picture? What am I showcasing? And what will change as a result? And that means engaging that particular audience, the white walls that my brother talked to me about, right? And to be recognized that putting something up on that white wall means an ethical commitment to explaining why they need to understand these issues and what is that complexity. And I think doing theory in a paper is about that form of audiencing. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Parvati, for that wonderful presentation. Indeed, it is a very, how do you call that, substantive and also something to reflect on in doing theory in terms of academic paper. And we are very much privileged to hear that from you. So I think it's time now for our question and answer. And please do key in. It's that this seminar is not yet over. So we have the chat box here, and we also have the chat box over Facebook Live and YouTube Live. Please do key in your questions, and we will be trying our best to relay this to Parvati. For those who are joining us also inside the chat box, inside the Zoom, I would like to encourage you also to please post your question or raise your hand. I have actually two persons that are in queue in order to ask to ask a question. So first, again, we are now on the question and answer portion. So there's one raising hand. Can I call in? Let me double check this. Can I call in Jonel Agustin? And if you can spotlight the technical team, if you can spotlight Jonel Agustin, if you can share your video or your screen also. Please do ask your question directly to Parvati. Jonel Agustin, Jonel Villegas, yes. Can you please spotlight him so that we can see him in the big frame? Thank you. Yes, Jonel, please do ask your question to Parvati.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Kabanda. And I'd like to also relay my warm appreciation to Dr. Parvati. This is really substantive, as Dr. Kabanda has said, lecture. And I'm quite interested because my field is in biology, in biodiversity conservation. And during my thesis, I tried writing my thesis with a theoretical framework or theoretical lens in it. But unfortunately, one of my panel members told me to remove the section, that particular part, because she said that it's not commonly done in fields like biology. So But I was thinking otherwise because I wanted to do some indigenous knowledge and ecological studies. Can Dr. Parvati give some enlightenment on this? Why is it so that fields like biology, they don't commonly do theoretical lenses, and is it really necessary uh, for additional information also for young researchers like me? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jonel. I think Parvati, you have a very good first question there. You are. So I'll turn now the screen to Parvati.
Yeah. No, that's a fantastic question and reminded me of something that I should have started with, which is that it is theory as convention. Okay, there are absolutely conventional modalities of doing theorization, and it's so good to have these questions because I learn so much from these things because you're absolutely right in pointing out that I didn't mention. Well, this is what I hear from you is that I haven't spoken about theory as convention, and of course there are strong conventional. There are strong conventions in how do you do theory, right? Which is based upon the discipline, the topic, and the location in which people are writing and the audiences to which you are writing. All of these will affect what is theory. Now, this is not to say that there is no abstraction in biology or in physics, for instance. Some of those are highly abstract, right? But they do abstraction differently. So what constitutes abstraction here is very different from what is abstraction in maybe the social sciences. Typically, for instance, you might look for theory as causation, yeah, or correlations, yeah, and the implications of that. So our hypothesis-based theorization, right? That's a particular strand of theorization which is related with particular methodologies and is very dominant in some physical sciences, yeah. And of course, what you're talking about, Jonel, is boundary transgressions, right? Is that you're talking about doing indigenous knowledges and theories of which have particular styles of speaking, and then taking that into biology, right? And so you're trying to do transgressive theorization. Now, the good thing for you is that actually there is a whole history now of transgressive theorization coming from multiple sources, yeah? And some of theorization, good theorization, is about finding your friends, is making sure that you have people who support you and who validate your approach, right? It's every form of writing, everybody needs to do this, right? That's why you do a literature review, because you're always building on a body of work. And you're always saying, actually, so-and-so has done all this work and I'm adding to it, or I'm fixing a gap in it, or I'm doing something else with it. So you always have this kind of inheritance of previous knowledge with which you're working and reworking, right? And in your case, there is an inheritance here, there's an inheritance here. But if your work itself is bridging that, then actually that's the conceptualizations you need to use. What happens if you use this body of theory and then use this kind of empirical material? Then yes, it's not clear to somebody why you're applying this form of theorization to this kind of empirical material, right? So there are some border straddling theorizations, like for instance in science and technology studies, for instance, or some forms of indigenous knowledge. But then that also means using your empirical material differently. It means using your empirical material within the border straddling theorization and writing within that. And that's where theory is largely conventional, right? There are conventions which are about discipline and so on and so forth. I think it is very, very difficult, but it is not unknown for people to break beyond conventions at a thesis level. You need very good supervisors who really support you, and you need excellent examiners, because remember that a PhD always, ultimately a thesis is is something that is, like I used to say about my Viva. Somebody said, oh, I got really anxious about my Viva. I said, I thoroughly enjoyed my Viva because I knew 2 people who had read my thesis. I'd spent 3 years writing a thesis. These are the only 2 people who will ever read it, my examiners. So, but you have to convince these examiners, right? So you need to align the way you present your empirical material, what you edit in and edit out within the conventions of that theoretical frame, and to find supervisors and examiners who also align with that. If you have theory from here, examiners from here, empirical material from here, supervisor from here, that won't work.
Thank you
and
so
your
much.
job with a thesis is to pass your exam.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely fantastic stuff afterwards, but you must pass your exam. Sorry, X.
No, sorry, Parvati. Actually, I was like, this is like, we discuss about theory in a very good sense and a very substantive way, but there are also like human factors around it. We have the supervisors that you need to convince first, and you have the examiners for you to convince first, and to be theoretically aligned with that kind of material that you have, and also the connection between the empirics and also the theory itself. And Jonelle, thank you so much for bringing that question. Indeed, it's a very good start to have this conversation about theory. And for the purpose of everyone, I think Parvati mentioned about Viva or Viva. So for our audience in the Philippines, Viva is a thesis defense presentation. So that's how they call it in the UK, in Singapore, and some other parts of the world. So Viva is the thesis defense presentation, or the oral defense, as I should say. So again, thank you so much, Jonelle. We have our second question. Can I call in Jeremy Barrido? Jeremy, if you're there and you have your video on, can you please kindly ask your question to Parvati? And I ask the technical team to please spotlight Jeremy to join us here, and Jeremy can ask a question. Thank you so much. Jeremy, please ask your question.
Thank you, Dr. Kabanda. And again, I'd like to extend my appreciation to Professor Parvati for giving a very substantial, as what Dr. Kabanda said, a substantial report or lecture on theorization. And as a budding researcher myself, I am interested, Professor Parvati. You mentioned that as a young researcher, as a budding researcher, we are susceptible to presuppositions, or we are susceptible to biases. So, and you mentioned about the balance between the empirical argument and the conceptual argument. So my question is, how do we strike? Do you have a practical tips on how do we strike a balance between factoring in the empirical framework and the conceptual framework in our studies? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Parvati, again, a very good question.
Yeah. So one a sort of point of correction. It's not because you're a junior scholar that you have presuppositions. Everybody comes to any research question with presuppositions, because whenever that's the way we make sense of the world, right? We don't always make it explicit, right? We see somebody walking down the road, right? And I live on a road down which there's some shops. So if there are people whom I don't know, I assume that there might be somebody else from outside going to a shop. I don't think about it. I just see them. But if I go back and think about it, I will know that that was my presupposition. That actually, because they're not familiar, there must be somebody from outside who's going down to the shops. Yeah. But usually when I look at them, I don't think about this at all. They're just passing by and doesn't matter. I may not even notice that they're passing by. That's how presupposition works all the time in our brain, right? So everybody has presuppositions. We don't often engage with that part of the brain where we think about what is our presupposition. Making those presuppositions clear is what is crucial. And in fact, I would say that junior scholars may be less likely to have presuppositions because they are more likely to be willing to accept that they do not know, right? The worst case scenarios of this are well-established academics who have so many presuppositions because they feel that they have done so much of research And therefore they come at these things in the same way. Yeah, so I'm used to my mind, my neural pathways used to going down and looking for causation, looking for certain kinds of things. And then I keep going back to those things. The best work, therefore, if you go for any conference, is the work where the PhD students are presenting. And it's always the place to go for actually breaking out of those presuppositions, right? If you go listen to the really well-established scholars, very often what you'll get is a repetition of their presuppositions. Not always, but very often, yeah? But the junior scholars have got this amazing capacity to not have had as many presuppositions. So, and that's why you will all inherit the world, academic world, and that's how it should be. With regard to the question of the balance, it's a difficult one, and I'd like to hear from other people who, because so many of you here have also written, so many papers. So X, you, Marcus, there are many else, and so many of you have written papers. But if you just look at, say, an 8,000 word piece, typically I would say like 400, 500 words to an introduction, maybe 1,000 words to a literature review, 800 words, 750 words to a methodology, and then quite a substantive piece, which is the empirical material, which is probably 3,000, 4,000 words. But in that 3,000, 4,000 words, you're always weaving in and out between the empirical and the abstract, right? So you're deploying the empirical to make your concepts clear. So it is not an empirical section alone. It is a section where your empirical material is explained or is used to push forward your conceptual argument. And therefore, it is difficult to talk about a balance. And then you always return to the implications of this conceptual advance. So there's quite a substantive bit of the conclusion, which will also return to that, that conceptual element. Some papers will have a discussion section where you want to really push ahead quite a lot. So you might say, actually, if you go back to that paper about circulation flows and non-circulation flows and friction, say, right? The next section, you might want to say, what does all of this imply for the concept? And that I might do a full substantive section on that, because the case itself of Namibia and so on and so forth may be so of inadequate relevance, and the concept flows, non-circulations and frictions actually needs developing in order to explain why does it matter, right? Why it matters is because you typically talk of flows of students, but then you don't relate it and the complexities of that to the flows of money. So, and that relationship can be a complex relationship. And there I might decide to do a full discussion section, which really pulls this out. This is very important. And I think for Global South scholars, there are some issues in this, because when the case study is about Burnley and in a British journal, people will not necessarily ask, why does Burnley matter? You do the same thing with Mindanao and people will say, why does Mindanao matter, right? And the other problem that we have is that we have to explain quite a lot about the practicalities, right? So this paper on flows, circulations, and flows, frictions, and non-circulation, I presented this at NUS. And it was really interesting because I had been working for a while with people in Africa, and then presenting, as I said, Singapore, people could not understand that actually they couldn't do digital transfers in Africa, right? Oh, but why can't they just transfer the money? Or are you really talking about people carrying cash, right? The degree of non-recognition, because Singapore is, I mean, actually in Britain, it's much more understandable because people still do cash. There's a much more, but Singapore, very technologically advanced. So it was quite difficult for somebody in Singapore to even understand. At the end of the paper, they said, I mean, they're carrying cash and traveling. I said, yeah. said, oh, we didn't even realize that such a thing was possible, right? So the extent of non-recognition means that you have to spend a lot more time explaining something. And that takes up a lot of words, which means that sometimes the place left for conceptualization and the amount of words left for it might be less. Then they'll turn around and say, oh, you haven't theorized enough. Or why does this theory matter to us? So, when you are writing into Western journals, these are issues, and they are issues that even me as in my editorial roles or in my reviewing roles, I also raise them. I always think about what does this audience need to know. So remember that it is harder work for us to get published. And I find this particularly in the case of African scholarship. So, one of the things that I find with African scholarship is that I'm allowed to theorize or to write about Africa so long as I use the right kinds of theory. So if I write about something, a general paper, which is theorizing in the language of the North, that's impossible. Virtually, it's very tough. What I can do is I can write about inequalities, I can theorize about injustices, I can theorize about patriarchy, but try letting me theorize about space and place from Africa. It's very difficult because space and place is much larger, and it feels like a discussion which is largely held by Global North scholars in the Global North, and I'm trying to bring an African case into it. The reviewers struggle to accept that. Right? So and these are conventions which are really problematic and against which I too struggle, right? So I am not saying this as somebody who's been hugely successful in being able to address this, but I keep trying. And we do need to work on trying to get that level of acceptability, that it isn't that only Global North scholars can, if I write the same paper, but using case studies from UK, they'll accept it, but not if it's from the North, from Africa.
Thank you so much, Parvati. I think it's really helpful for us to think about all these things, especially coming from different scholars in the Philippines, coming from different scholars in Mindanao or in Visayas or in Luzon, the different large provinces in the Philippines, wherein we're always very, enthusiastic to present a case of one town, of two towns or three towns in an international audience. And sometimes we assume really that they know about what's going on in there. And it's good that you have given us these ideas on how to really bring out the conceptual of this, that it can make relevant to other people. And I think I encourage everyone to, maybe I know you have a lot of questions on this because we do like to write this kind of, cases. So please do key in your questions in the chat box and also in Facebook Live. I have another question, Parvati. I'll just read it out from our audience on Facebook Live. I think her name is Pia. She's asking, what advice or technique can you give to make easy the alignment of theories, and the framework, especially the aspect of qualitative research design? I know it's a very big topic, but if you can give briefly some advice to this, Parvati.
Yeah, I think it's a crucial question. Again, thanks so much for that. I think it's always return to why you're writing this paper, right? What is it that, just because you have the empirical material there, that doesn't necessarily make it something that is publishable. Just because I spent 6 months collecting a whole lot of data, that doesn't mean that that anybody in the world wants to know about it, right? You have to think what is in it for the audience. And based on that, you will be able to identify what it is that you want to edit it and edit out. So the framework in some ways and the theory really comes out of that key moment of recognition of what is it that I want to say. And I say it as not somebody who's very good at identifying, often have, several thoughts simultaneously. But you need to identify one concept or one thing that you want to say in one paper, right? And then just keep saying it. say why it is important, say how it is important, and then say why it is important again, right? And think all the time, this is a journal, and go back and look at that journal. Now look at the journal, look at the theories within that journal. Think about what are the discussions there that you're feeding into, right? So if you write into a journal about a topic that is hardly ever discussed there, they'll tell you, go and send it to some other journal, right? So align your frameworks to the audience that you're speaking to. Because typically, I'm saying, yeah, I usually go to this journal when I'm looking for something. If I'm, for instance, looking at for some aspects of theorizing post-colonial theory, I often go to something called the New Literary Review, or yeah, I think that's what it's called. And now I find that very useful. I'm a geographer writing on migration. Why would I go to New Literary Review? Because I find some of the best theorization, some of my concept bending moments there. I don't go look for that kind of post-colonial theory in say, the Europe, say the Geoforum, yeah, a geography journal. I don't go there for that. I go to Hypatia when I do write on care ethics. Hypatia is a feminist journal of philosophy. I go there to think about, what's happening in care ethics currently. That's where I go, because that's where that debate is happening, right? So you need to follow the debate, which is in that particular journal, how your material adds to that debate. And sometimes it's, a paper is rejected from 2 journals and then it's accepted by a 3rd one because finally I found the right journal. Yeah, not necessarily. And so aligning with the conversation, making sure that, for instance, have I got easy check are the references that you have cited, which journals are they being published in? Then that's probably the journal for you for your paper.
Thank you so much, Parvati. Indeed, this is the importance of literature review, of reading, of thinking, and critically examining the resources, the literature that we have. So we have 2 more minutes. There's one more question, Parvati, that I can accommodate. We are only running into 1 hour. There are so many questions running in, but this one from Rose Perkins, she's asking simply, what's the difference between argument and problem statement? So it's sometimes like in the Philippine context, Parvati, problem statement is just like a template. This paper would like to ask the question this, and what is this, what is that, and so on. So she's asking the question, what's the difference between argument and problem statement?
X, perhaps you know this better than I do, because clearly you're familiar with that terminology.
Yeah, I think they would appreciate if you can, have some short insights with the argument and the problem statement itself. And we will end in a few more minutes. Thank you so much, Parvati.
Okay. No, not at all. Oh gosh, I am not quite clear about this myself. So and this is always a process of learning. But so do come in. I mean, can I invite everybody who understands this better than I do to come back in? But I think the problem statement is what is the issue that needs to be addressed, right? And making sure that you make clear why that is important, right? That an argument is already a response to that problem, right? It is in part that actually I want to suggest these as perhaps a solution or as a way of understanding that problem, or a conceptualization of that problem. Yeah. So a problem statement, in my view, typically is something like the rationale. Is that what a problem statement is for you? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So it does slightly different things. A rationale is very much about why do this work. And an argument is actually, this is the work that I'm doing with it. This is what I would like to suggest is the solution.
Thank you so much for that, Parvati. And we are right on that at 5 o'clock in the afternoon in Singapore and Manila time. And I know there are lots of burning questions from our audience this afternoon, but we will see each other in few more sessions, and you can always bring out these questions and ask our different resource persons coming over. And you can, of course, freely, if you wanted to reach out to Parvati, you can just search Parvati Raghuram, and then you can send her email directly. And I'm sure in her free time, Parvati would be happy to answer your questions. And she's the nicest person that I've ever known in the field of migration. Not to be biased with others, but she's one of the nicest, and the nicest for me. And again, thank you so much for joining us. And it has been a very good session this afternoon, but just some housekeeping. I was told by the organizing committee back in Davao del Norte State College. Sorry, I am so, how do you call that, mixed up with different provinces in the Philippines. So they will be sending you, those who have registered at Eventbrite, they will be sending you an evaluation form. And please do kindly answer the evaluation form, and it will be very helpful for us to improve on our session. So there will be few more sessions related to writing academic paper seminar series, and the next sessions are also we have very exciting scholars that can provide insights to us. And again, if you are with us joining wherever in YouTube, in Facebook, and here in Zoom, please give us a round of applause. Give Parvati a round of virtual applause, and of course, gratefulness for the sharing this afternoon. And indeed, it is our privilege. It is really an honor for Parvati to share about theory this afternoon. And again, for those who are joining in other parts of the world, thank you also for joining us. And we hope to see you on session 3. We will be coming out with advertisement and with posters in the next coming weeks. And we have another very important resource person that will share to us. You can still continue to ask questions, and we would be happy to address them. And again, our purpose here, the aim of this series is to bridge scholarly divides between scholars in the global south and the global north, and find ways to remediate these gaps. And I hope that when we finish this series, we will be able to attain and achieve this objective. Again, thank you for joining us. This is Ezekiel Cabanda from the National University of Singapore. And thank you so much for the technical team from, again, I will not make a mistake, from Davao del Norte State College, led by Fritz, and of course, by VP Elson Huesca. Thank you for organizing this, and thank you for tuning in with us. Again, thank you, and have a good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone.